Book TV at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas to talk about his latest book, Darwin's Doubt. In the book, Mr. Meyer discusses the mystery surrounding the origins of the animals that appeared during the Cambrian explosion over 500 million years ago. This is about half an hour.
Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute and author of Darwin's Doubt, the explosive origin of animal life and the case for intelligent design. Dr. Meyer, what was Darwin's doubt?
It's a great place to start the conversation because that's what I do in the book, is I tell the story of this salient doubt that Darwin had about his own theory and what's become of it, the way it's grown up to become illustrative of a major crisis in evolutionary theory. The doubt he had was about something called the Cambrian explosion, which is the geologically sudden appearance or abrupt appearance of most of the major groups of animals in a geological period called the Cambrian, quite a long time ago, about 530 million years ago. And Darwin was aware of this problem, and in The Origin of Species, he addressed it and acknowledged that it was a problem for his theory. And basically the problem is that, as he understood it, life should unfold in a very slow and gradual way. He depicted the history of life, in fact, as a branching tree that was in which the base of the tree, or the trunk of the tree, represented the first simple one-celled organism, and all the terminal branches represented all the forms of life that we see today. All the connecting branches represented all the intermediate forms that should have arisen through the vast eons of time. He also thought that that process should take very slowly because his mechanism of natural selection, acting on random variations, also had to act very slowly. The variations, as he conceived of them, would be small, minute, incremental. If they were huge or big, then that would result in deformed animals that couldn't survive, and therefore the process of natural selection and variation had to work very slowly and gradually. And yet what he witnessed in the fossil record, and what scientists at the time knew, was that the first major groups of complex animals came on the scene fully formed very abruptly in the sedimentary layers. And this was contrary to what he thought the picture of the history of life should be, and it was also contrary to the way his mechanism of natural selection, as he conceived it, as it should act. So it was a real puzzle to him. He said, therefore, that the Cambrian explosion was, he said, a valid objection to the views here entertained. And that was his doubt. And what I do in the book is tell what's become of that doubt.
Where did Charles Darwin write that?
Right in The Origin of Species. It was one of the things that he expressed very modestly as far as the limitations of his theory. I opened the book by saying that when he finished his masterpiece, The Origin of Species, he thought he had explained every clue but one. And the Cambrian explosion was the one big thing that he thought he knew that he had not yet explained. Now, he had an idea about what might later explain it. He thought that eventually paleontologists would find that sequence of intervening forms in the lower pre-Cambrian strata. But as I explain in the book, subsequent fossil finds have actually intensified the mystery rather than alleviated it.
Where did the name Cambrian come from?
It was one of the names of the geological layers. Cambria is a place in Wales, and the earliest locale for Cambrian fossils came from Wales, and so the name was given from that location. There are now Cambrian finds, fossil finds all around the world. The most famous are in Canada in Burgess Shale, and one in southern China near a city named Chengjiang, the Maoshishan Shale.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you why you included pictures of Chengjiang,
exactly.
China?
Yeah. Well, I'm telling the story of what happened to the Darwin's doubt. And there's really two mysteries that I address in the book. One is the mystery of the missing ancestral fossils. And that mystery has become more acute because of the subsequent fossil finds that have been made since Darwin's time. He expected to find the missing ancestrals in those lower Precambrian layers. But what's been found instead is more Cambrian animals, new forms that were not known in Darwin's time, each of which in turn, or most of which in turn, lack any ancestral forms in the Precambrian rock, any discernible connection to those presumed ancestors. So the mystery's become more acute for that reason. It's also become more acute for a couple of other reasons. One, the period of time in which the most explosive period of the Cambrian explosion has gradually shrunk down to about 5 to 6 million years. There's a seam in the rock, one of the stages of the Cambrian period, in which between 13 and 16 new animal phyla come into the rock record very suddenly. And that makes it even more difficult to explain the origin of all that new form and structure. And the other thing that's made the mystery more acute is that for a long time people thought, well, maybe we're not finding those missing ancestral forms because they were too soft. They were soft-bodied creatures rather than hard-bodied creatures that are easier to fossilize. And maybe they were too small. So there was this idea that the missing ancestrals were an artifact of our incomplete sampling of the fossil record. But in that same southern Chinese fossil location, paleontologists have found in the lower Precambrian strata, beneath the strata that document the sudden appearance of the major animal forms, they found sponge embryo fossils, small, microscopic, and soft-tissued animals. And that's really a mystery because it shows that the depositional environment was perfectly suited to preserving the ancestral forms of all those other forms that are lacking ancestors, and yet they weren't found. And so that's really put to rest the idea that we didn't find them because we were either not looking hard enough or because the environment in which the rocks and the fossils were fossilized were not suitable to preserve them.
So therefore, Stephen Meyer, we have this mystery.
We got the big mystery.
How do you explain it?
Well, maybe there's one other thing I should say first, because the mystery has two parts. And the first part is the mystery of the missing fossil, but what the book addresses is really the deeper mystery. And that's the mystery of, it's essentially an engineering problem. How would you build an animal, or any of these complex animals? There's 23 odd phyla that first arise in the fossil record. One of the most famous phyla are the arthropods. They include critters like trilobite. And I've got a little fossil visual aid, if you'll permit me.
I'll hold it up for the camera.
And those are 3 trilobites. One of the amazing things about trilobites is that they had compound eyes, and in this particular fossil, you can actually see the compound structure in the eye. And so paleontologists were aware of this exquisite functional integration, this functional complexity, right from the very dawn of animal life. And that raises a question quite independent of, well, where's all the missing ancestors? What mechanism could build something this complex, in particular in the amount of time allowed by the fossil record? And what I do in the book is I examine not just the Darwinian mechanism, but the modern neo-Darwinian mechanism, which is a little more sophisticated. It doesn't just emphasize natural selection and variations in the general sense. It emphasizes natural variations and mutations in genetic material, the way that modern evolutionary theorists would understand the mechanism that generates large-scale change. And what I show in the book is that there are a bunch of reasons to doubt that mechanism has the creative power that's long been attributed to it. One of which is what we now know about the importance of information, of genetic and other forms of biological information, to the maintenance and to the construction of animal forms. I used to teach a lot of freshmen when I was a college professor. And
what did you teach?
I taught the philosophy of science. And I would ask them, if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? We've been talking a lot about information at this conference, and they would immediately get it. They're young, they're in the techie generation, say, well, you need code or a program or instructions or software, all of which are correct answers. Well, it turns out that the same thing is true in life. If you want to build if you want to generate life in the first place from non-living chemicals, you have to have information in the form of DNA to build the proteins that makes cells viable. But if you want to build a new form of life from a pre-existing form, and this is what Darwin was trying to explain, you've also got to have actually reams of digital code. You need new tissues, new organs, therefore new types of cells, and each new type of cell needs new proteins, and those proteins in turn require information. So the Cambrian explosion is not just an explosion of new form and structure, new animals. It's an explosion of information, of digital code and other forms of biological information. And what I show in the book is that natural selection and random mutations is a singularly inept mechanism for generating new information. Mutations, random changes in code or software, we know from our own experience, tends to degrade information, not generate new software programs or operating systems. And the same thing turns out to be true in the living world. If you start mutating sections of genetic text, you're going to degrade that information, And mathematically, it turns out to be extremely improbable that you would ever be able to find even new genes or proteins in the time allowed by the evolutionary process.
Where did you teach?
I taught at Whitworth University in Washington State.
And what kind of college is that?
It's a liberal
arts
college.
Christian-oriented college?
Yeah, Christian-oriented.
Where did you get your PhD?
I got it from Cambridge University.
And what's it in?
In the philosophy of science, particularly the philosophy of biology. Did my dissertation on the question of the origin of life and on Darwin's method of scientific reasoning, which is actually how I get to the idea of intelligent design, oddly enough.
And your subtitle, I want to show that. It includes the words intelligent design. How do you define intelligent design?
Great question. Intelligent design is the idea that there are certain features of biological systems that are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than an undirected process such as natural selection acting on random mutations. Maybe the best way to understand the theory of intelligent design, what it's saying and what it isn't, is by understanding it in contrast to that particular meaning of evolution that it was formulated to challenge. There are different meanings of evolution. We're not challenging all of them. One of them is the idea of change over time, and that's indisputable. No one challenges the idea that life now is different than it was a long time ago. That's what the Cambrian explosion, the book about the Cambrian explosion is all about that. Another meaning of evolution is the idea of common ancestry or universal common ancestry. A third meaning of evolution, however, is the idea that an undirected, unguided process, namely natural selection acting on random variations and mutations, is sufficient to produce both the new form and structure that we see arising in the history of life, but also the appearance of design that almost all biologists recognize. Richard Dawkins, the great modern spokesman for modern neo-Darwinism, puts it this way. He says that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And for Dawkins and all neo-Darwinians and classical Darwinians, the key word there is appearance. Living systems look designed, but they're not really designed because there's this unguided, undirected mechanism, namely natural selection acting on random mutations that can mimic the powers of a designing intelligence, but which is not itself designed or guided in any way. Another neo-Darwinist, Francisco Ayala, says we have design without a designer. Okay? So intelligent design is challenging that idea, saying no, the appearance of design in many cases is actually real, and the best explanation for that, based on what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world and the evidence we see in biology, is an actual designing intelligence, that there is purposive intelligence behind the process that gave rise to life.
So, Professor Meyer, is intelligent design a theological term?
No, it's a scientific term, but it may have larger theological implications. It's based on science, based on scientific evidence, and also an established method of scientific reasoning, even if it has larger implications. I think there was a debate here yesterday, and both of the speakers said one of the reasons this issue is so contentious is that however you answer the question of biological origins, you're going to be giving an answer that has larger worldview implications, or you may be challenging somebody else's worldview. Every worldview has to answer the question of what's called the prime reality, or the metaphysical question. What is the thing from which everything else comes, or what is the process from which everything else comes? Darwinian evolution says, well, the living things we see around us arose as a result of an undirected, unguided material process, and therefore it seems to have larger materialistic implications. The idea of intelligent design says, no, there was a purpose of intelligence involved in the process, and therefore it has implications that support, for example, a more theistic interpretation of the natural world. But it's not a proof for God's existence, and it's not based on theological propositions, as, for example, creationism would be.
Page 391, Reasons to Regard Intelligent Design as a Scientific Theory. You write, many scientists and philosophers of science regard testability as an important feature of scientific inquiry, and intelligent design is testable in three specific and interrelated ways.
Right. Let me back up on that one as well, because the first thing I think that's important to understand is how I made it in the book. In looking at these two mysteries, the mystery of the missing ancestral fossils and the mystery of how you build an animal, I show, particularly in that second part of the book, I show that the neo-Darwinian mechanism lacks the creative power to generate these complex animals, and especially the information necessary to build them. But that's a critique of neo-Darwinism. a lot of people want to know, how do you get from that to a positive argument for intelligent design? And here's where Darwin's own method of scientific reasoning was really important in my thinking. When I was a PhD student at Cambridge, I studied Darwin's method of scientific reasoning. And I think he was a great pioneer in the development of an historical or forensic style of scientific reasoning. Stephen Jay Gould has made the same point. If you want to explain something like the Cambrian explosion, you can't go into a lab and make the trilobites come into existence all over again. The phenomenon you're trying to explain is not replicable. So what you have to do is reason more like a forensic scientist and look at the clues that are left behind and then infer from those clues back to the causes of the events you're trying to explain. And the method of reasoning that Darwin used is actually now has a name. It's called the method of multiple competing hypotheses, or the method of inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation, according to Darwin, is one in which you're citing a cause which is known to have the power to produce the effect in question, the effect you're trying to explain. Now, when I realized that that's what Darwin was doing and that's how he was reasoning, I realized that applied directly to this critical question that's all throughout evolutionary biology, which is the question of the origin of information. Evolutionary theories I believe, come to an impasse in trying to explain the origin of genetic and other forms of biological information, and I show why in the book. But it's not the case that there isn't, but there is a cause of which we know that is capable of generating information. In other words, there is a cause that meets Darwin's key criterion of a best explanation, a cause which is known from our uniform and repeated experience in the present to produce the crucial thing we're trying to explain. If the thing we're trying to explain is information, what is it that we know from our uniform and repeated experience, the basis of all scientific reasoning, about what it takes to generate information? Well, one information scientist put it this way. He said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. What we know from experience is that minds generate information. If we look at a piece of software or a section of a book, a paragraph in a book, or a headline in a newspaper, or even information embedded in a radio signal, and we trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. So whenever we see information, we immediately infer that a mind played a role. Now, the Cambrian explosion isn't just, as I said, an explosion of form and structure, it's an explosion of information. And so I argue that the best explanation, using Darwin's own principle of reasoning, that we should be looking for a cause which is known to produce the effect in question, is actually intelligent design. Intelligent design explains that because it provides a causally adequate explanation for the phenomena in question, which is information, or an explosion of functional information in the Cambrian period.
How has intelligent design been portrayed in the media?
Well, we advocates have sometimes been told we're creationists in cheap tuxedos. It's been portrayed as another form of creationism. It's been portrayed as a religiously motivated idea. I remember doing an interview on Nightline, and the Nightline people came out and told us how interested they were in the scientific basis of the work we were doing, and I waxed eloquent about digital code and molecular machines and the circuitry that's involved in the development of animals. And after about an hour and a half, then a voice from New York chimed in and wanted to know, well, who is the designer? Who is the designer? And I said, well, we can't tell that from the theory of intelligent design. We can just tell from the evidence that some mind of some kind was responsible. That's what you can tell by analyzing the evidence on the basis of our uniform and repeated experience. But he kept pressing me. He wanted to know what I thought from my personal religious beliefs. I said, well, sure, I think ultimately that God is the explanation, because I happen to be a theist, but not all intelligent design advocates are, et cetera, et cetera. The Nightline interview had 3 words from me, and they were, I think it's God. And so that was what we sometimes, they had a take on this, a way they wanted to portray this from the beginning. And so the media has often tried to portray this as a religiously motivated idea. Time magazine said it was a faith-based idea. And I understand why the media sometimes portrayed it that way, but it misses a crucial distinction. It's the distinction between the basis of the idea and its possible implications. Intelligent design is based on scientific evidence, the presence of digital code in cells, the presence of circuitry in the programs that are responsible for animal development, the presence of molecular machines, and it's based on a standard method of historical scientific reasoning, which Darwin himself used. Having concluded using that evidence and that method that there is evidence of design in nature, that then raises a larger question, a philosophical question, and that is about the identity of the designer. And people may answer that different ways. So the theory of intelligent design is based on science, but it raises these larger philosophical and theological questions. It may even have theological implications, but that's separate from the theory itself. And the media have typically tried to conflate those, or have maybe inadvertently conflated those, and that has portrayed to the public the idea of a kind of an idea of something that's a kind of biblical fundamentalism or something behind intelligent design. That's really not what it is. Intelligent design's an inference from biological evidence, not a deduction from religious authority.
Now, Stephen Meyer, here on Book TV, we've talked with professors, religious professors or science professors, who, when we asked how long has mankind been on the earth, the answer was literally 6,000 years. Is that an accurate answer?
No, and it's also not what the theory of intelligent design is about. In a sense, you're asking about the difference between intelligent design and creationism. And there are two main differences. Creationism is based epistemologically on its belief in the Bible. Its starting point is an interpretation of the Genesis text, and then there's some kind of deduction from that to what we ought to see in the natural world. It's also an idea about the age of the earth. It's a particular interpretation of the Genesis text that says that the earth is very recent, the universe is very young, and the theory of intelligent design is not a theory about the age of the earth. It's a theory about whether design is real or merely apparent. And secondly, the starting point for intelligent design is not the biblical text or church authority or any other religious document. It's the evidence we find in biology and in related fields. So it's an inference from biological evidence, not a deduction or interpretation of Scripture.
Is intelligent design, as you've portrayed it, taught in public schools?
Not very often. I think we have actually discouraged people from trying to bring intelligent design into the public schools at the secondary level, high school level, and below. For the simple reason it just immediately becomes enmeshed in these complicated church-state jurisprudence issues. There was a train wreck of a case in Dover, 2005. We were urging the school district not to try to get intelligent design into the schools, and we got blamed for what they did. We were actually asking them not to do it. I declined the opportunity to testify as an expert witness in the famous Dover case. We think it's counterproductive at this point. We think we've got a terrific scientific argument. We're trying to make that argument at the highest levels of academia. We're doing research and science. We have labs and scientists around the world. We're building a research community. The public school debate is actually a bit of a sideshow for us right now, and we're encouraging people not to get into that.
Who's we?
The Discovery Institute, which I am affiliated. It's the institutional home for a lot of the research that's going on in advancing the intelligent design research program.
Page 109, you write, even if we assume that mutation and natural selection and other similarly undirected evolutionary processes can account for the emergence of novel proteins and body plans, we cannot also assume that the protein molecular clock ticks at a constant rate. Unlike radiometric dating methods, molecular clocks depend on a host of contingent factors.
The passage you're reading is from a chapter in which I was addressing one of the ways that people have tried to solve the problem of the missing ancestral fossils in those lower Precambrian layers. Since the fossils aren't documenting the ancestors, a lot of scientists have said, well, maybe the genes do. So if we compare genes from different animals representing those different major groups, we can make some projections back in time as to when we would find when the common ancestor of those animals might have existed. And the rule is that the greater the degree of similarity between two genes or proteins in different animals, the shorter the time they diverge from a common ancestor. The greater the difference in the genes, the longer back was the period of the divergence, sometimes called the deep divergence hypothesis. What I show in the book is that that method of trying to account for the missing ancestral fossils or to establish the common ancestors doesn't work either. And the reason it doesn't work is two main reasons. The first is that depending on which proteins or genes you choose to compare, you get very conflicting trees, showing different relationships between all the different animals, different branching points, different transitional nodes in the tree of life. And so I argue that if this method of investigation was giving us a true historical signal, we should get an unambiguous signal, one that is giving us a single tree that is telling us the story of one historical unfolding of life. After all, history only happened once. That we get so many conflicting trees, I think, raises questions about whether the method is sending an historical signal at all. The other problem with this method of investigation is that it begs the question. It says that the degree of difference between two proteins or genes in different animals is an indication of how long ago they diverged from a common ancestor. But that they diverge from a common ancestor is presupposed from the outset of the investigation. And it's presupposed in all the algorithms that analyze and compare the gene sequences. So you can't use a method of investigation that presupposes a common ancestor to establish the existence of a common ancestor. That's a question-begging strategy, and that's the argument I make in that section of the book.
Darwin's Doubt is published by HarperCollins. What's on the cover here? What's this?
That's a wonderful trilobite with a couple of those eyes peering back at you with all that intricate and beautiful structure from the dawn of animal life.
How old is that?
About 530 million years, maybe a little less.
We've been talking here on Book TV with the author of this book, Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute. Darwin's Doubt is the book. Thank you for being on Book TV.
Thanks for having me on. It's a great conversation.
Is there a nonfiction author or book you'd like to see